This is There I Find Family, a Strawberry Sands Beach sweet romance novella. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Chapter 1. Lana Landry walked up the beach, smiling as the lighthouse near Raspberry Ridge came into view. She lifted her face to the spring breeze, chilly and bracing, which blew in from Lake Michigan. Like many people, spring was her favorite season. The long, harsh winter was over, and long, warm summer days filled with sand, swimming, and fun lay ahead. Only this year, things could be different. Her heart twisted a little. She'd been contemplating a decision for a while, had been turning it over and over in her mind. She thought she knew what God wanted her to do, and normally she didn't dilly-dally when God opened a door. In fact, most of the time she'd eagerly run through the doors he'd opened. But this door was harder than the rest. She smiled as 3 children, long skinny legs and, even at this early date in the year, tanned faces, came rushing toward her from the lighthouse just up the way. Their legs churned over sand dunes and the sparse grass that cropped up further back on the beach as the kids came rushing toward her. She'd been visiting Pianse's foster children at least once a month all winter, but it had been more than a month since her last visit. "Miss Lana! Miss Lana!" The kids called as they ran toward her, their arms wide. She braced herself a little. She wasn't as young as she used to be. Mid-50s wasn't old, exactly, but it was older than she thought she'd be as she considered the decision she needed to make. As the kids reached her, she caught a glimpse of Pianse coming out, walking more slowly beside his father, Joe. Joe was the reason Lana had started coming up the beach to begin with. He had been living by himself at the lighthouse, and, like a good neighbor, she had been concerned about him and had checked in on him occasionally. It was the chocolate-covered espresso beans that had first alerted her to the fact that Joe had a son. Joe had offered her the beans, saying that his son, who owned and operated several businesses in Chicago, had sent them to him and he didn't care for them. Lana had become addicted after the first bite. From then on, when Pianse sent chocolate-covered espresso beans, Joe had made sure that Lana had gotten them. "Mr. Pianse said we could swim today if you came," Callie said happily as she wrapped her arms around Lana's waist. At 10, Callie was the oldest of the 3 foster children. "I sure hope he doesn't think I'm going to get in that freezing cold water. You do know that it's a lot warmer outside than it is in the water." "We know. It doesn't matter. We want to swim." Florence, who was 8 years old, wrapped her arms around Lana's waist and squeezed tight. "I haven't forgotten how," August said. He was the only boy and the youngest at 6. He was also the least afraid of anything, and quite a handful. Pianse had earned more than a few gray hairs since August had come into his life. The thought made Lana smile. Pianse had been stayed, and maybe even stuck in a rut. The children had loosened him up some. Still, 3 children was a lot for a man who was nearing his 60th year of life. Lana had been thinking for a while that the Lord wanted her to offer to help him, maybe hire on as a nanny, but that would mean leaving Strawberry Sands and the town she loved. Every one of her children lived there. It wasn't like Raspberry Ridge was so far away, but it felt like it sometimes. Still, Lana had lived long enough to know that if God wanted to move her, she'd better go, because that was the way to true happiness, doing what God wanted. even if it felt like something she would never want to do on her own. "Can we wade in the water?" Callie asked, peeking hopefully up at Lana. "You need to ask Mr. Pierce," she said, smiling a little at the idea that she would be able to give them permission. The children had treated her almost like a mom since the first time she met them. It was kind of funny, and made Lana feel even more like what God wanted her to do was exactly what she was supposed to. Not that the children were perfect, but they were so sweet and innocent, and they just wanted a family to love them. Of course, one could figure that they wanted their own family, not a patched-together one, but sometimes what a person wanted wasn't what they got. "Oh, yes," August said, turning around and running as fast as his little legs would carry him to where Pierce and Joe were just coming around the dunes. The girls chattered around her, and she smiled, answering their questions and nodding as they told her what they had been doing on their Saturday morning. August's cheer of happiness broke into their conversation, and the girls turned as their brother ran straight from Pierce directly into the waves, calling as he did so, "We can go to our knees!" The girls took after their brother, and Lana smiled at them. The air temperature was a balmy 80, which felt positively hot after the frigid temperatures of winter. It was the first 80-degree day of the year, and it felt like a heat wave. However, from experience, Lana knew that Lake Michigan would be nowhere near that warm. But her own children had been the same way. They could hardly wait to get back in the water after a year of winter days that were too cold to swim. After 45 minutes of swimming, give or take, the children would come out, shivering with blue lips and goosebumps all over their skin, but smiling and happy. Also hungry. Nothing made a child hungrier than to swim in cold water. "Hey there, haven't seen you for a while," Pierce said as he and his father got closer. Lana turned from watching the children wade at the edge of the lake to smile at the man who had become a very good friend to her. "I'm sorry. We had Easter and then several big conferences back to back, and the bed and breakfast has been packed." "I know. It's just good to see you." She texted him occasionally, although they didn't have a daily time when they talked. Still, she was comfortable enough with him that she could pick up her phone and call or text any time. "Hey there, girlie. I'm on my way to go fishing. If you want to come, you just mosey on over. I have a chair set up for you." Joe didn't hug her. He wasn't that kind of man. But he nodded over where there were 3 chairs set at the spot where he usually spent most of his days beside the lake, with a line or 3 in the water. Lana glanced at Pierce, who had a small smile on his face, but she couldn't tell if that was what he wanted to do. "Maybe I'll be over," Lana said, and Joe nodded, giving his son a lifted brow before he began to shuffle over to the chairs. "He loves fishing," Pierce said as they watched him go. "He says he never catches anything, but he always has fish on the line." "I think that's the way all fishermen are. It's bad luck to say you got more than you need." "He's shared with me more than once, and I've appreciated it." "He's generous." "And you inherited that trait," Lana said as their eyes met, and Pierce took her compliment, an expression that might have been pleasure moving across his face before disappearing. They turned together without saying anything to watch the children as they frolicked in the shallow water. "I don't understand how they can stand that. It's so cold." Pierce gave an exaggerated shudder as they moved forward to a small rise in the sand. "There's just something about being shut up and away from the water all winter that makes children willing to endure a lot of hardship in order to swim." She wasn't sure she could explain it, but she knew from experience that was how her children were. "Do you want to sit here for a bit?" Pianse asked as they reached the top of the rise. "Okay." The sand was warm as she lowered herself down. Her knee ached, and her back gave her twinges. She definitely felt her age in the aches and pains of her body, which made her admire Pianse all the more. He had decided to foster these children, and the last she heard, he was working on adopting them. She admired that. He wasn't just living life for himself, but had looked around to see what he could do to help others. It was one of the many things she appreciated about him. The more time she spent with him, the more things she found to admire. They sat in silence for a while as the laughter of the children drifted up and Lana lifted her face to the sun. Pianse shifted beside her and she looked over. "Are you going a little stir-crazy with the children inside?" "I can't say I'm disappointed spring is here." "Has there been much accomplished on the house?" she asked. The last time they talked, he had said that he was building a house in Raspberry Ridge where he owned property. "I'd like to take you to see it later if you'd like." Her eyes opened wide. "Today?" "I've already talked to Dad. Once the kids are out of the water, I've got some lunch ready for them, and then, if you have time." He looked hopeful, or at least that's the way she thought he looked, and she nodded before she thought about it. She had the entire day off. Her children had insisted, since she had been working so hard with the conventions that had been held in Strawberry Sands. The whole town was excited that they were finally getting some of the Chicago business Blueberry Beach usually did. With the construction of the inn and with the school that had opened and the horses were a big draw too, Strawberry Sands seemed to be on people's radars. And she was leaving. Maybe. "Absolutely. I have the whole day off, and I was thinking that I would spend most of it here." "All of us will love that, and we might end up keeping you longer than you want, but I can drive you home if it gets too late." "All right." She looked back out at the water and smiled as Florence stood with her arms wrapped around herself, but she didn't seem to want to allow the cold to drive her out of the water. "Are the kids enjoying school?" "I think that was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Pulling them out of public school and putting them in the private school in Strawberry Sands. They really seem to be thriving." "It's not going to be that much further of a drive from your place in Raspberry Ridge." "It's not." He let out a breath. "Is it terrible that I'm a little bit afraid of summer vacation? I mean, I'm looking forward to spending more time with the kids. They're fun." He laughed a bit. "I never thought I'd actually say that, but it's true. I have such a great time with them, but all day long every day?" "You'd mentioned that before, and I've been thinking about it." He looked surprised as he turned to face her. "You have?" Lana met his eyes for a moment before she looked back out at the lake. She didn't need to look at him to see the rugged set of his jaw, the hair that was tinged with silver, the piercing blue eyes, strong nose, the hairline that was receding. He didn't look younger than his age, but he didn't look older either. He had struck her when she first saw him as a hard businessman, determined to be successful, and maybe a little ruthless. She didn't really see much of that in him at all anymore. With her heart pounding and her stomach churning, she dug her fingers into the sand behind her and said as casually as she could, "I thought I might help you." Chapter 2. Pianse stared at Lana. He was too old to be captivated by a woman. He thought he had known everything there was to know about women. that a man had to be careful around them, careful about what he said, what he did, careful how he said things. They could pick up on the least thing and make a mountain out of something he didn't even realize he'd implied. He got himself in trouble more than once, and while he had longed for years for someone to walk beside him through life, he hadn't been trying very hard to find that someone. It just seemed so complicated and difficult, and every time he tried, he seemed to come up short. It was hard on a man's ego, especially a man who was used to being successful in every area of his life. He had been a successful businessman, a successful part of the Chicago political scene, and a successful patron of the arts and many charities. But Lana had challenged him in a way that few people ever had. She had given him some straight talk when he desperately needed it. He never doubted it came from the Lord, because in his interactions with Lana after that day where she challenged him to give up his cushy life and to do something that actually mattered, he realized that she wasn't typically that type of woman. But her words had struck a chord deep inside of him, a chord that had needed to be struck for a while. Because his life was selfish. He spent his days working for himself, earning money that he could spend on his own at his own leisure. His one daughter didn't take much time, and while he tried to have a relationship with her, she preferred to spend more time with her mother. Which had been fine with Pianse. That had given him more time to work on his businesses and enjoy his leisure. But Lana had stepped in his life and challenged everything he did with a few short words. Then she walked back out like she hadn't just changed his life. He'd been fascinated by her ever since, and even before. She was the kind of woman that a man just looked at twice and then wished she was his. At least, that's the way he felt about her. But she had a family of her own, a life she'd established and was happy in, and he doubted she would be interested in merging that life with his. Except she kept coming around, more to see his dad than anything else. She'd somehow managed to finagle her way into his dad's heart, which truly said something, since there weren't too many people his dad gave room to. Lana was one of the few. But being that she spent so much time with his dad, it made him want to spend more time with him too, and it made him realize life was short and his dad wasn't going to live forever. And then, when she challenged him to do more, he just so happened to stop at a light in Chicago where there was a sign along the walk asking for foster parents. It was kind of funny the way the Lord worked things out sometimes. Because of Lana, the thought of being a foster parent had been on his mind, and then that sign. And then the next thing he knew, he'd done the research, taken their training, and had signed up for siblings. And they'd given him siblings. 3. Now he couldn't imagine his life without them. But somehow, through it all, Lana had been in the back of his head the whole time. And now she had offered to help? He'd been tempted to ask her more than once, to ask her for a little more than that. Maybe he hadn't expected things to move quite so quickly with the foster children and the situation there. Maybe he thought that Lana would be coming along for the ride, or that they would have time to grow closer. But with him wrapping up his businesses, moving to live with his dad at the lighthouse temporarily until his house was ready, and then with the children coming, he hadn't had time to pursue a relationship, because that's what he wanted. He just hadn't been sure if that was what Lana wanted. But He reminded himself not to get his hopes up. She was all about the children. "Help with the kids?" he said, knowing that he heard her correctly, but not sure exactly what she meant.
I didn't know if you were interested in a nanny, perhaps.
A nanny? Knowing that he sounded ridiculous because he kept repeating everything she said. But this was exactly what he wanted. Well, not exactly, but closer to what he wanted than what he had. You would do that?
I've been thinking about it. I guess the Lord laid it on my heart to offer.
But that would mean leaving Strawberry Sands.
I know.
And the bed and breakfast. You've been there for years. That's since
I got married. That was almost 35 years ago.
And all your children are there. Her smile was soft and her eyes amused as she turned to face him, still keeping her head tilted so the sun hit her skin.
If you're trying to talk me out of it, you don't have to. Just say no.
Yes, I want you. I had considered more than once asking you, but I didn't because I know how close you are to your family and your children. I didn't want to take you away from that and from the bed and breakfast as well.
I appreciate your consideration, but I've been praying about this since the night of the beach bash, when you told me that these were your foster children and you were going to start working on adopting them.
I got a little stuck on them. It just seems like I would not be doing them a favor if I brought them into a home where they didn't have a mom and a dad. A child should have both.
I agree,
Lana said easily, although maybe there was some kind of hidden meaning behind her words. He didn't want to look at them too closely, didn't even really think about it, since he was so excited and happy that Lana had volunteered to help him with the kids. I have been a little bit worried about doing this on my own. This winter has been full of learning experiences for both me and the children.
I'm sure. The rest of your life will probably be like that. My kids were born into my house, and I still felt like I barely survived some winters. I don't know why the summers are easier.
She chuckled a little, not necessarily because it was funny, but just because. So it gets easier. He had been worried about having the children home all the time.
I suppose it's relative.
There was still humor in her tone.
And I suppose it also depends on what the summer brings. But maybe it's because you're not stuck in the house together all the time. Or maybe it's just the dark that makes things so much harder.
Or the cold.
That's true. And the snow and ice and wind and all those fun things.
After he thought for a minute, he had to add, I wouldn't trade Michigan for anywhere. I know it doesn't sound like it, but I love it here. He looked out over the lake, and he knew, for him, living beside it was better than living in Florida, where it was sunny all year. But Lana already knew that. At least, he assumed she did, since she was still there too. Of course, she hadn't been as blessed as he had in life, and maybe she'd never had enough money to move somewhere else.
I love it here too, she said,
as though she was listening to his thoughts. The children still played in the water, laughing and squealing and chasing each other, but he knew it wouldn't last much longer. It couldn't. The water had to be freezing.
Sometimes, especially on the dark days of winter, I would think that it would be nice to live somewhere warmer, but I've never had the urge to pack up and go.
I've had the urge to pack up and leave the city, but I've never had the urge to pack up and leave the lake.
Right, I can understand that.
She gave him a glance.
I wondered if you chose to move here because you didn't want to raise your kids in the city.
I guess I just think that there are some important things they need to learn here, and there are a lot of things that I don't want them to learn there." She nodded and didn't ask any more. He figured she didn't need to. "What exactly did you have in mind?" he finally said, when she didn't speak at all. He wanted to know what she had meant about being a nanny.
"I guess whatever you need, or want, since you seem to be doing really well on your own."
"I want to adopt the children." Those words came out without him thinking, but he couldn't take them back, and he didn't want to, so he just kept talking. "That was actually my thoughts to begin with. I mean, I went through all the training to be a foster parent, but I can't imagine shuffling kids from house to house. Although I suppose there's a place for foster parents to take care of children until their parents are able to. That's a little different."
"Yes, I agree. A temporary situation where parents can't take care of their children for whatever reason. That's different than children who are looking for a new home."
"A permanent home. I was up front with the foster agency when I spoke with them. I didn't want to be a temporary home. I wanted to be a permanent stopping point."
"And are Callie and Florence and August looking for a permanent home?"
"Yes. Their mother is dead and their father is in prison. He signed away his rights, and they were being raised by a variety of relatives."
"I see. That's sad. But they seem so happy."
It's amazing how resilient children are, but you also wonder how much of that is going to mark them.
"True."
"But I didn't want to adopt them."
"You didn't?"
Lana said, her brows drawn down as she gazed at him, as though trying to figure out what he was saying, since he just seemed to say the opposite. "No, it seemed like it was unfair to have them be in a home with just a father. They deserve both a mom and dad." He held his breath and clamped down on his tongue. What he wanted to say was that he had been tempted over the few months that he had the kids to ask if she would be interested in being a mom to them. That wasn't all he wanted to ask her, because being a mom to his children would mean being married to him. It seemed like a backdoor way to get a woman to marry him, and it wasn't exactly an area he had any experience in. He never considered adopting children before, and he certainly never considered asking anyone to be a mom to his adopted children. It was all so strange, and not the way the world worked.
"I can't disagree with that. Although I raised my children with no dad, and while I do think that they felt the hole in our family, some of them more than others, it was the best I could do."
"I think there's a big difference between what you did, where you didn't have a choice. Your husband left you. You couldn't exactly decide at that point whether or not you wanted to continue to have children and to raise them by yourself." She chuckled, but it was without humor.
"That's true."
"This is different. I would be deliberately bringing children into a home with no mother, and while the adoption agency and the foster groups have told me that I'm allowed to do so, as long as I take the training and my house passes inspection, I just feel that's not the best for them, and I've always been about doing what's best." Her lips curved up in a smile, and his heart turned over. It wasn't that Lana was so beautiful when she smiled. She was middle-aged, and she looked it, from the fine lines around her eyes to the age spots on her face, and her hair that had lost its youthful sheen and the figure that had lost its youthful slimness. Still, somehow her smile had the power to turn his heart over and render him speechless.
"You seem like the kind of person who makes sure that everything you do is done to the best of your ability. I admire that."
It took him an embarrassing long time to realize that he was staring at her, and he yanked his eyes away. "Thanks." He mumbled, knowing it was way too late.
"What's the matter?" she asked, and her words were gentle.
He shook his head. He could hardly tell her that he had been staring at her, not really paying that much attention to what she said. He couldn't believe that she didn't know, that she wasn't thinking that he was crazy, or maybe figuring out that he wanted her as more than a nanny. Nothing. But I guess as long as I have the children, I would really love to have you as a nanny, however that looks.
It's not that far between Strawberry Sands and Raspberry Ridge, but a nanny implies someone who lives with the children.
That's what I would prefer.
I was going to ask.
Neither one of them could say anything more as their conversation was interrupted by Florence.
"I'm hungry. No, I'm starving," she said,
drawing out the word starving, like she was dying. August was behind her complaining of the same thing. Callie, slightly more mature than her siblings at 10 years old, walked behind them, her arms wrapped around herself as though that would keep her warm. Would you like to come in? I know Dad's going to want to stay out and fish, and he probably wouldn't mind your company, but I would like it too. He wasn't used to children interrupting him when he was in the middle of conversations. He had so much more he wanted to say to Lana, so much more he wanted to hear her say to him. He could talk to her all day long and not be tired of it. But he couldn't be irritated with his kids. They were just telling him what they needed and expecting him to help them and to meet their needs. That was what he was there for.
"I'd love to come up. I want to talk to your dad and you, but I was serious about being a nanny."
Maybe we can talk about it later while we're looking at the house. She nodded, and they pushed themselves off the ground as the children reached them. They were soaking wet from the waist down. Even though they were only supposed to be up to their knees, they had splashed up the water, and he even thought he'd seen August sitting down in it. The boy was completely soaked, and if Pianse was a more experienced father, he probably would have thought to bring towels out. Let's get you guys inside. You can get dried off, and we'll get something warm in those bellies.
"Can we go swimming later?"
Florence asked, her teeth chattering, her lips blue. We'll see, he said, knowing that he didn't really want them in the water when the only one watching them was his dad. His dad was very responsible and a great swimmer, but Pianse himself was overwhelmed sometimes with the three of them. He wouldn't want to do that to his dad. Not in the water. Callie had already taken Lana's hand, and she skipped alongside, chattering away as Lana nodded and smiled while they walked toward the lighthouse.
"Hey, wait up,"
Florence said, as she realized that her sister had walked with Miss Lana without her.
"I'm hungry,"
August said again, slipping his little hand into Pianse's and making his heart squeeze. The trust these children had in him. It was humbling and scary. He helped his wife raise their daughter, at least as long as they'd been married, and then he'd taken his turn at raising her, as much as their custody agreement would allow. But having 3 children was a lot different than just having one. 1 was easy. 3? Sometimes he panicked because he didn't know where all 3 of them were, not to mention the fighting. They bickered and argued with each other until he thought he would go insane. But they always made up, and any time someone outside of their family picked on them, they all ganged up together. It always made his heart smile to see how the siblings defended each other naturally, without him even having to train them in that. Maybe that had something to do with the way they'd been raised, and the way they hadn't had a very stable family, so they automatically formed their own. but he had a feeling that that might be the way siblings normally were, regardless of their parental situation. He put those thoughts out of his head and tried to focus on what August was saying to him. The blue sky, the warm breeze, the sand under his feet, and the laughter of the children, coupled with the fact that Lana was with them, made him determined to just enjoy each moment as it came. He was old enough to know that life went by fast, and these moments were precious and meant to be cherished. Especially since he didn't know how long Lana would stay. Chapter 3.
Are we there yet?
Lana smiled at the whine in Florence's voice. They'd only been on the road 10 minutes. But she expected a short ride, and apparently, to her anyway, 10 minutes was not short enough. Almost, just a couple more minutes.
It just takes so long,
she said, her voice indicating that she was close to expiring in the back seat.
So, did you guys get the swing set put up?
Lana asked, remembering that the last time she talked to them, they'd been excited because Pianse had told them that as the house went up, they were going to have a swing set up as well.
Yeah, that's why I'm so excited about going. We'll get to play in the swing set, and we don't have one at the lighthouse. I can't wait to move.
Pianse just smiled as he turned into the long lane that led back to their property on the bluffs. Raspberry Ridge was a small town, similar in size to Strawberry Sands, but on a ridge overlooking the lake, and there was no road to get to the beach. People had to take a trail down to the shore. It would probably never be as popular of a beachside town as what Blueberry Beach or Strawberry Sands was, just because there was no beachfront. Although, as they crested the small hill and came upon the few houses that were scattered along Main Street, Lana could appreciate the view. There was just something about being able to look out and down on that open space that made her feel light and happy. Pianse took a right at the end of the street and followed the bluffs for another quarter of a mile. The houses from town faded away, and the house he was building came into sight. There were no construction vehicles, probably because it was Saturday, but it looked like the house was pretty much done from the outside.
Well, it looks a lot different than what I had pictured.
It's a lot different than the last time we talked. They've got a lot of work done in the last 6 weeks. She wanted to ask how soon they'd be moving in, but she wasn't sure that he would want to talk about that in front of the children, so she waited. The kids had their doors open almost before Pianse had come to a full stop. Just make sure that if you're going to come in after playing outside, you don't track any mud in the house, okay? Pianse called after them. Callie shouted back an okay, while Florence just raised her hand, and August said something to the effect that he wasn't going to come in the house ever unless someone made him. Their youthful exuberance made Lana smile.
Once upon a time, we were young and had energy like that,
she said, and while there was a bit of a wistful note in her voice, she was happy for the wisdom that she had gained in the years since. I never really played on swing sets when I was a kid.
You're kidding.
Her eyes widened, and she looked at him in disbelief. He shrugged a shoulder. Nope, I don't recall ever doing anything like that.
What a life.
He grunted a little, but didn't elaborate. She figured that with him growing up at the lighthouse, he did other things, like fish with his dad, and they probably took a lot of boat rides as well. She supposed he would want that for his children, although he basically told her that he wasn't adopting them, which was a bit of an about-face, because he had been doing all the things necessary in order to get the paperwork through and call them his. She wondered what made him change his mind, or if it truly was just what he said, that he wouldn't be doing them a favor by bringing them into a single-parent home. He opened the door, and she stepped in. She had to stop, look around. It looked like it was entirely finished, and it was beautiful. It consisted of an open floor plan where she could see the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen all from where she stood. "Wow," she breathed, taking a moment to absorb the high ceilings, the comfortable-looking couches and chairs, and the well-appointed kitchen. She toed her shoes off while he did the same. "Was that a good wow or a bad wow?" he asked with a small laugh. "A good one. This is amazing. I guess I don't really know what I expected, but it feels so warm and welcoming. Yet the high ceilings make it feel spacious and accommodating as well." "I guess after spending the winter in the lighthouse, which is small, as you know, and not very bright since there aren't a lot of windows, I really wanted something that was not claustrophobic, not in any way." "I think you succeeded, and I love it. Although the kitchen looks really fantastic." "I thought you might like it, considering how much cooking you do at the bed and breakfast." She slipped him a look, not sure if he was saying what it sounded like he was, that he had been thinking of her as he planned his kitchen. That was not something she had expected, but it made her heart do a little happy dance and feel warm and fuzzy. She walked slowly in, moving beside him as he allowed her to just look. The colors were mostly neutral, some warm brown wood tones with a few accent colors, mostly greens and blues. It made things feel soft and inviting and relaxing at the same time. It was definitely a home where people could walk in and feel welcome and comfortable. "It looks like it's completely done," she said as they moved into the kitchen. "It is. I'm just waiting for the occupancy permit and the last inspection. I didn't want the kids to get too excited because sometimes these things move slowly." "It's going to be hard for them to leave this." She stopped at the table and put a hand on it, while he sighed. "I've been thinking of a solution, but I wasn't sure how you feel about it." His eyes lifted to hers, and he seemed to be judging her facial expression as though basing his next words off of how she looked, or maybe how he thought she felt. "I'm not sure what you're saying, why it would matter how I felt, but go on." "Well, you did offer to be a nanny." "And I meant it," she said, wondering if that was why he was concerned about how she felt. She was still confused and waited while he gathered his thoughts and then began to speak. "That day in the lighthouse, the day that you told me that I needed to live for more than myself, that I should do something good in the world, it really hit a nerve. You didn't know it, but I had been struggling with just those thoughts and feelings. Like, nothing that I have done in my life really mattered at all. I mean, I always tried to do good, be kind to people, and everything like that, but I had never actually spent my time, my spare time, on anything but myself. In fact, I guarded it pretty judiciously, feeling like I deserved a break. That seems to be the prevailing wisdom of the day, that you work hard and then you deserve time off, relaxing time, whatever." "That's true. I think God wants us to relax some." "I think our society, and humans in general, take it too far. We think we do a lot of work, but actually we're just working for ourselves." "I think that's true." "I didn't think I was going to get an argument from you." "You're not," she said, and they smiled at each other, before his expression grew serious again. It felt like there was something in the air between them, something sharp and crackly. She wasn't sure exactly what it was, but it made the hair on the back of her neck stick up, and her breath came more shallowly than what was comfortable. She waited impatiently, trying to allow him the time to find the words he needed. The kids have been a blessing to me this winter. They helped me shave off some of my rough edges. Or maybe more accurately, they showed me that I have a lot more rough edges than what I thought I did.
Kids do that.
Yeah, he said, lifting a brow, his expression saying that it was an understatement. He pursed his lips, looking over her shoulder before he met her gaze again. I struggled with the idea of being a single dad. I keep thinking that it's not fair to the children, but part of me thinks that maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe I don't really want to make that kind of commitment. Maybe I want to go back to the way it used to be, where I had all the time I wanted to do whatever I wanted to do. Around work, of course. But I love my work, and doing extra work really was no hardship. It was definitely for me. Because I can never use all the money I was making. What does one man need with all that money? 90% of the people in the world live on a lot less. I didn't need it.
I think sometimes we think we need a lot more money than what we actually do.
Or maybe I just love making it. I love the feeling of satisfaction, like I accomplished something, when, in reality, it doesn't really matter.
For eternity. It doesn't matter for eternity.
Right.
She waited, since this didn't seem to be his point. But she had no idea what he was leading up to.
I guess I could talk all day about that. But the thing that I came to the conclusion is that I really wanted the children. I want to adopt them. But I don't want to do it alone.
You want a wife, she said, as she tried to keep the
hurt, disappointment, sadness out of her voice. Yes. She stared at him for a little bit, wondering if he was going to ask her to help him find one. She almost snorted at the thought. He had been in the upper echelons of Chicago society for decades. He wasn't going to need her help to find one. He could find one on his own. Or ask one of his business associates. There were probably women lined up in rows who would be honored to be on his arm. She didn't know anything about that life, and she didn't know any women in Strawberry Sands, other than herself, of course, who would be wife material for Pierce. And if he thought she was good wife material, he wouldn't be asking her to help him find one.
I think that's a good idea, she said slowly.
You do?
Yes, you're right about the children needing a mother, and I can't argue with that.
The problem is, the children have kept me from pursuing the woman I want. I don't know how she feels about me, and I can't exactly find out when all of my time and energy has been spent taking care of the kids and doing the bit of business that I have left.
I see.
She still did not understand where she fit into this. But in today's society, people don't exactly get married for any reason other than love. That seems to be the benchmark of what constitutes a reason to get married. Anything else seems to be frowned upon, I guess.
Maybe that's a little crazy.
That seems like the dumbest thing to use to base a lifetime commitment on, the way a person feels in the moment.
Yeah, she said,
Although there was a part of her that wanted a man to marry her because he loved her enough to want to make a lifetime commitment to her. But maybe her idea of love and the world's idea were two different things. Since the world's idea seemed more like lust or infatuation. She wanted a love that would stand the test of time. That hadn't been what she had for her life, though, and she had mostly come to terms with that. A lifetime love just wasn't something she was going to get. "You don't agree?" he asked, apparently not convinced by the tone of her voice.
To some extent, I don't think that what I think about love and what the world thinks about love are the same, but I do think that for women especially, there needs to be an emotion involved.
They don't want a clinical, "we're going to commit to each other and stay committed no matter what"?
She laughed a little at his description. No, I think women want a little bit more romance.
Women don't have dibs on romance.
I know, but in general, it seems like it's more important to the female gender than it is to the male.
I guess I can't argue with that, but I kind of want romance.
Kind of.
I'd rather have commitment, loyalty, fidelity. Someone that I can depend on and who is stable and not twisting me around in circles as I try to do what she wants and have what she wants change every day.
Some women are like that.
Yeah, I've experienced that, and I'm not interested in going back down that road.
Maybe at our age there are a lot of people who aren't interested in going back down that road, or going down the romance road at all. It can leave scars when it doesn't work out.
Like it has for you? He asked, his eyes seeming to see past the front that she usually put up. She didn't want to say it was a front. She was happy. But he was right. There were scars. There was hurt and sadness and disappointment. The sense of deep sadness that something she'd valued so highly, something she'd worked on so hard in her life, hadn't turned out the way she wanted it to.
I guess, she finally said.
That makes me a little nervous.
What?
She asked, her mind coming back to the present after traveling down memory lane where she typically didn't walk. Because I was hoping that you would agree to marry me and raise these children together. With me. Chapter 4. Pierce held his breath. This was not the way he had intended to ask Lana to marry him. It wasn't the way he had intended to tell her what he had planned either. But it was the way it came out. He could hardly go back and do it over, so he held his breath and waited.
"Mary," she said.
Her voice sounded a little faint. Her hand went to her throat, then fingered the neck of the collar of her shirt absent-mindedly, like she didn't really know what she was doing with her fingers, just needed to move a little. Crazy, isn't it? You can just ignore me. But he didn't want her to. He wanted her to see him, to see the vision he had, to know that he wanted someone to walk beside him and he thought that she was perfect for the job. Not job, position, that he wanted to walk beside her, to support her, to create something with her together. That he thought that they would make a good team, that they would not only be able to parent the children that were playing outside at that very moment, but that they would be able to support each other for the rest of their lives, however long that was.
No, that's not crazy. I suggested being a nanny, and I assumed that if I didn't get up early every morning and drive here, staying until late every night, I would live here. marriage. That makes more sense. The children would have a mom and a dad.
Yeah, you know I wanted that. But it's not just about the kids. Her eyes shot back to his, and she blinked, as though his words had completely changed what she was thinking.
It's not?
No. I guess maybe I can't declare undying love for you. I'm not sure what that looks like. But I can say that the idea of walking beside you, of creating something together, of raising these children together, I can't think of anyone else I'd rather do this with.
Really? You must know a lot of women, a lot more talented and successful women than me.
Talent and success doesn't really matter much when we're looking at things eternal.
But I'm just a mom who runs a bed and breakfast.
You ran a farm with your children after your husband left you, and you've been successful, not just running the farm and the bed and breakfast, but in raising your children. He shook his head. But none of that matters. I mean, it does, but not really. It's your character that I'm looking at. The corners of her lips tilted up a little, as though she were looking at character as well. From where he stood, it looked like she had a lot more character than he did, but she nodded knowingly.
That would be the reason that I would say yes, because you are a man of your word, and I feel like I can trust you because you've always done what you said you were going to do, and I have to admire someone who's willing to put what could be the easiest years of their life aside and choose to give those years to 3 children who need a family.
I think you might be giving me more credit than I deserve. If it hadn't been for you suggesting it, I wouldn't be doing it now. So, if you're going to find someone to admire, you could admire the person in the mirror.
But I only said it. You're the one who did it. I didn't go try to foster anyone.
That's because you were waiting for me. He couldn't keep from smiling a little, and maybe teasing her a bit, because he didn't think she was doing any such thing. But she didn't smile back. If possible, she looked more thoughtful.
Maybe. You know, not on purpose, but because that was just the way the Lord worked it out. I wasn't expecting it, but I almost went and began the training that I would need to do to become a foster parent. I just didn't. Not over the winter.
I see. So maybe the Lord was working things out and this was meant to be? He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He wanted her to do the Lord's will, of course, but he didn't want this to just be about the Lord's will. There was a part of him, maybe it was a prideful part, that wanted her to choose him because of something else, something more elusive, something like admiration, love. Maybe he was more romantic than he thought he was, because he didn't want her to be with him because of duty. But that seemed to be what they were heading toward, a marriage of duty. That wasn't what he intended. But he wasn't sure how to go back and change things now.
I've been feeling for a while that God was pulling me towards you, but this was not what I was expecting.
Lana bit her lip and looked at him.
Do you mind if I take a few days to think about this?
Of course not. I want you to make sure that you're making the right decision.
If this is what God wants for me, I want to do it. But I also want to talk to my children first. The Bible says in the multitude of counselors there is wisdom, and my children are some of the wisest people I know.
You have every reason to be proud of them.
I don't know about that. If there's anything good in them, it's because of the Lord, and not anything that I've done. But I want to make sure that this isn't going to be something that's going to end up tearing my family apart.
I don't think it will be. Your children will probably be very excited for you, but I totally respect your need to talk to them. Please do.
Have you talked to your daughter about it?
I haven't. Maybe I should. He wasn't that close to his daughter. She had a tendency to want to do whatever her mother wanted her to. Of course, she'd gone through her rebellious teen years where she hadn't wanted to do what either one of them wanted to do, but he and his ex-wife did not have a close relationship. On the contrary, the further away from her he was, the happier he was. But maybe his relationship with his daughter was something that he should try to fix as well. Thanks to Lana. She continually seemed to open his eyes about things that he hadn't thought about. Her hand sat on the counter, and after a split-second thought, he covered it with his, carefully, and slowly, just in case she wanted to pull it back, she would feel like she could. But she didn't. Her eyes went to their hands and seemed fixated on the sight of them together. All my life, I've heard that you should marry someone who makes you better. He paused, then plunged on. Maybe that's part of the reason I'm asking, because since I've met you, you've challenged me, encouraged me, made me laugh, and made me think, and I'm a much better man now than I was before I knew you. Maybe me asking you to marry me is a little selfish.
If you're trying to talk me into it, you've succeeded.
She sounded a little breathless, and he had to laugh. I'm not trying to talk you into anything. I'm just trying to make what I asked you to do a little less clinical, because it's not just about the children, and it's not just about us being better together. It's about how I feel about you. But that's a little harder for me to talk about. She lifted her eyes to his, and she looked as insecure as he'd ever seen her.
Maybe I need that a little.
I figured you probably did. I'm trying.
She nodded, and then she swallowed hard and looked away.
She didn't say how she felt about him, or even give a hint as to what she was thinking. He wanted to say that maybe he needed that a little too, but she probably knew. Maybe she wanted to wait and see what her kids said before she spoke out of turn. Or maybe she didn't want to get his hopes up until she knew for sure that she could move forward. I want to show you the rest of the house, and I won't push you about this anymore, but maybe we can talk about it sometime?
Give me 2 weeks?
He wanted a day, 2 at most, but he nodded. 2 weeks is fair, and if it's not enough, we can have more. I think the adoption can move forward as soon as I submit a little paperwork, but it might be better if we wait and decide whether or not we're going to do this together, so there can be 2 of us on those papers and not just me. She nodded.
That makes sense.
I won't breathe a word of this to the children. Not until you know.
Oh, I thank you. I wouldn't want them to have their hopes up, whether I end up being their mom or not, until I know for sure.
Yeah, we want to keep things as stable as possible for them.
I agree.
Keeping things as stable as possible meant for the children to have a mom, in his opinion, but he felt like now it was up to the Lord. He'd asked, he did what he thought he should, and what he wanted to do. Sometimes those 2 things were the same, and he was fairly certain they were in this case. But Lana had to believe that was the case as well, and then do it. All right. He pulled his hand away from hers and straightened. Let's check out the rest of the house, and then maybe the kids would like to walk down to the beach?
She nodded. Thank you for giving me time. I appreciate it.
He thought maybe she was going to say something about how she felt, but she didn't, and he was impressed that he even wanted her to. Normally, he didn't get wrapped up in a bunch of feelings, and he would prefer the clinical, analytical outlook. But with Lana, everything changed. He wanted to know that she felt the same way he did. But he needed to be patient and give her time. That would come. Eventually. Chapter 5. Lana looked over the living room of the bed and breakfast where her family gathered. The children she raised, just herself and the Lord, laughed and chatted as they gathered the food and carried it to the table. Soon they would not all fit in the house, as big as it was, and they'd either need to have their family get-togethers outside or forego them. The thought made Lana sad, but she knew that life changed, people grew, families grew apart, and the things that she loved would eventually fade away. That was why she needed to enjoy them while she had them, and not take anything for granted. She paused for a moment after setting the mashed potatoes on the table and looked around at her children. Her oldest son, Matt, and his wife, Jubilee. They were happy business owners of a riding stable in Strawberry Sands. They were successful, but more than that, they loved the Lord and were doing their best to serve Him. That was her definition of success. Her second son, Luke, and his wife, Kristen, were the same. Their path to happiness hadn't been easy, but Kristen glowed as their girls chattered with their cousins. Luke looked upon his wife with adoration on his face, the way a man should look at his wife. It made Lana happy to see it. And then there was her daughter, Sunday. She'd been through the most tragic experience a parent could ever have, the loss of her child. Noah, the man who had not just helped her through it, but helped her see that perhaps, even though it was a tragedy, good could come of it, stood with his arm around her, smiling down into her upturned face. They had the kind of relationship that Lana always wanted, the kind where her husband wasn't afraid to put his arm around her and whisper something in her ear that made the two of them share laughter together. Eleanor, with trials of her own that she'd overcome, stood beside her husband Franklin as they discussed whether they put enough seats at the table. He teased her, and her cheeks pinkened, and then he bent down and kissed one, making her laugh and lean into him. Lana couldn't be happier for them. Then there was Ryan, her version of the prodigal son. For a while she thought that he might be the one child of hers who did not settle in Strawberry Sands. But he left the rodeo and came home, only to find that his childhood friend, Dakota, had moved in and taken over her Graham's souvenir shop. For a while, Lana hadn't been sure whether the two of them were going to get together, but there had always been something special between them. They had a solid friendship, and they built a beautiful love story on top of that. It made her smile just to think of it. And last, but certainly not least, her daughter Clara, who was a brilliant artist and who had married her boss, a brilliant businessman. He had been the one who had encouraged her to use the talent God had given her and take the risk of being an artist. Of course, they'd fallen in love along the way, and now Clara held their child in her arms, while Alexander put his hand gently on her stomach where their second child lay, snug and warm, and due in the summer. Lana took a breath. She thought her children would be happy for her, and she was pretty sure that they would encourage her to do what God wanted her to do. But it was going to take her away from them. Not terribly far, but far enough that she found herself dragging her feet. It was too bad that Pierce had ground in Raspberry Ridge. It would make the huge, life-changing step of marrying him a lot easier if she had her family around to bolster and support her. But maybe it was God's will for her to move away from this family so she could focus on not her new family, but yeah, her new family. Maybe the children that she would be adopting would feel more like her children if they had their own home and had her all to themselves most of the time. When Lana was here, her kids and grandkids were in and out constantly. While it made for a fun and happy time, it did take a lot of her time and attention. She knew and believed that God knew best. If she was supposed to move to Raspberry Ridge, if she was supposed to accept Pierce's offer of marriage, which opened up a whole new bundle of fears for her, then she would do it.
Mom, are you okay?
Sunday came over. She'd always been the most perceptive of all of Lana's children, very in tune with her moods. Sometimes Lana had to be extremely careful when she was around Sunday, because it was almost like Sunday could read her mind.
I'm fine, but I do have something I want to talk to everyone about.
All of her grandchildren chattered around the table, laughing and teasing each other. Almost like siblings, since they spent so much time together. The children that Lana would be adopting were about her grandchildren's age. It made her feel old and a little scared.
Let me get everyone settled, and then you can talk to us, unless you wanted to wait until after we ate. Let's do that. Maybe the kids will go outside and I can sit with the adults and share something that is happening in my life.
That made Sunday's brows go down, but she nodded and called everyone to the table. The meal was delicious, with everyone having a hand in it. Lana loved these meals, where everyone came and ate at the bed and breakfast. Even though she didn't own it anymore, she continued her duties as hostess and cook and housekeeper, although she had much more time off than when she had been in charge. She'd have to give it up completely, and while that thought made her sad, she figured she'd have plenty of cooking and housekeeping to do in Raspberry Ridge with 3 children and a husband who would work from home. A husband. She didn't think she'd ever get married again. She hadn't wanted to and hadn't been looking for it. But if God was opening the door, she'd be a fool not to walk through it. God knew best. The meal was happy, lots of laughter, lots of chatting, sharing family news and plans for the summer, excitement all around, and Lana basked in it, although she did notice the occasional worried glance from Sunday. She tried to smile reassuringly. Her news was not going to be bad news. She was determined about that. After the meal, after they cleaned up, after the last dish was put away, they ended up going out and sitting around the small campfire. The children played on the swing in the yard and chased each other in a game of tag.
Mom, did you have something you wanted to tell us?
Sunday asked as everyone settled around the fire, a couple of her daughters with blankets around them, although it wasn't terribly cold.
I did,
she said, looking around the campfire at the familiar faces of all of her children. She didn't want to think too hard about what she was going to say, but just tried to let the words flow.
I think some of you know that I've been going to the lighthouse to help an older gentleman who lives there alone.
And you bring back those confounded chocolate-covered espresso beans, and now my wife is addicted to them, Luke said, with an exaggerated put-out sigh, while Kristen elbowed him in the ribs.
Don't let him say that. He's the one who can't get enough of them. So you take your mom's espresso beans and say they're for me?
No, that's not true. Everyone laughed. Lana smiled benevolently at her children.
As long as I have them, I'll share them. Although I can't say that I won't be upset if you take my last bean, because I am a little addicted." "A little?"
Eleanor asked, with her brows raised.
"That's my story. I'm sticking to it."
Her children laughed again. This was what she loved. They spent so many evenings sitting around the table after supper was over, just laughing and talking and sharing about their lives. It had always been like that. There were days where some people were upset with others, sibling arguments and rivalries and those types of things. But for the most part, her children had pulled together, knowing that if they wanted to keep the farm, if they wanted to stay together, if they wanted to keep their life along the lake, they all had to work for it. And they all jumped in and did everything they could to make sure they were able to stay. She loved them all so much.
"Mom, what is it?"
Eleanor said, picking up on the concern that had been on Sunday's face.
"The man has a son, and the son and I have developed a friendship."
There was a bit of a gasp, as some of her children who hadn't been paying attention to what she'd been doing were surprised. Dakota looked like she already knew exactly what she was going to say, and she gave her a gentle smile. That was good encouragement, and Lana continued.
"He has started to foster 3 children, and he is considering adoption. But he would be a single dad."
She paused and then plunged ahead.
"We're thinking about getting married."
This time, there really was an audible gasp from almost everyone, including Dakota. "Married?" Luke said. "Are you serious?" Matt asked, his brows drawn down just as much as his brother's.
"I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking seriously about it. He's a nice man, but more than that, he's a man of character. He's stepped up to be a father, and I have to admire anyone who would step into fostering 3 children. That is quite a step of faith, and it shows his unselfish nature."
"Sometimes people foster children for the money."
"They do,"
Lana said, looking at Ryan and meeting his gaze. She couldn't blame him for being suspicious.
"He's actually given up money in order to do it. He has sold or downsized his businesses in Chicago and only kept what he'll be able to run from Raspberry Ridge, where he owned property."
"Raspberry Ridge," Franklin said, consideration in his tone. "You mean right up the road from here?"
"Yeah, it's actually still in the school district for Blueberry Beach, although he's been sending his children to the school in town."
Everyone nodded, knowing well the couple who ran the school. They all supported it and were grateful that they were able to have such a wonderful alternative to public schooling in their community. While Blueberry Beach was a nice town, the state dictated a lot of what had to be taught in the schools, and parents who didn't agree with that type of curriculum and the emphasis on things other than a good education had no choice but to pull their children and find an alternative.
"So you'd be moving?"
Clara said in a small voice that made Lana want to get up and go over and put her arm around her. She needn't have worried. Her husband, Alexander, shifted, putting his arm around her and pulling her close. She laid her head on his shoulder and looked up with a small smile.
"Yeah, that's why I'm talking to all of you. I believe this is what God wants me to do, but the Bible says in the multitude of counselors there is wisdom, and it doesn't hurt to discuss things with other people before you make a decision. This is a rather big one, since marriage is a lifelong commitment."
At least, it was supposed to be. It hadn't been the last time she'd been at the altar, but that had been through no fault of her own. She had stayed true. She actually had stayed true long after her husband had cheated and left. Not necessarily out of loyalty toward her husband, but more because she didn't want to have any kind of trauma when she was raising her children. This was the first time she was seriously considering matrimony, and, truth be told, she was petrified. I've seen him around, and Mom, if this is what you feel like God wants you to do, I'm totally behind you. 100%, Matt said, his voice filled with confidence which carried around the campfire and into the night air. Mom, you have the best moral compass of anyone I've ever met. I know God could ask you to do anything and you would do it in a heartbeat. I appreciate you taking us into consideration, and I support you, whatever you do.
Even if it's a mistake?
Lana asked, wanting to be clear that while she believed it was God's will, even the most well-intentioned people could sometimes make a serious and life-altering mistake. Absolutely. You supported me through my mistakes, Luke said with a laugh. Same, Ryan said, and everyone laughed again. Ryan had been the one who was most likely to run headlong into something that he should have stayed well away from, and everyone continued to love and support him anyway, although there were times where people were more than a little frustrated with him. Mom, I'm really happy for you. I think it's about time you find someone to love.
Even if it means 3 more children in our family? Because if he adopts them, I would be doing the same.
The more the merrier, Ryan said, and there were murmurs of agreement all around the campfire.
Are you sure? Because he's asked me to marry him, but I asked him to give me some time to think about it and go over it with you. I am fine if you guys need some time to think too. I have as much time as I need, although I asked for 2 weeks.
Good night. If you had asked me to wait for 2 weeks to give you time to decide whether or not you wanted to marry me, I would have been on pins and needles the whole time, Alexander said, laughing down at his wife. That comment made her heart clench. She hadn't meant to make things hard for Pierce. She hadn't meant to make him feel like she needed so much time to make up her mind. Was he on pins and needles? He seemed like a very realistic, logical person who didn't need a whole lot of fancy words to make him happy, but maybe she'd been too methodical about it, too lost in her own head, and hadn't considered how the need for extra time and to make sure she was making the right decision would affect him, would make him feel like maybe she didn't care about him, which was not the slightest bit true. She admired so much about him and loved their time together, found herself wishing he was around when he wasn't, and found herself starting out for the lighthouse just for a chance to see him. Like she was a teenager instead of a mature woman in her mid-50s.
Mom, if you want to do it, if you think that's what God wants you to do, don't keep the man waiting,
Sunday said, with Noah nodding in complete agreement beside her.
Okay, I'm gonna pray about it tonight, but I'm pretty sure that my answer to him is going to be yes, and that means that we will be having 3 more children at these family get-togethers. And they will fit right in,
Jubilee said, as she watched the children chasing each other around the tree in the yard, while 2 of them pushed a younger one on the swing. Lana followed her gaze and praised the Lord for her family, for their unselfishness, because more children would mean less for them, because she couldn't treat her adopted children any less than how she treated her actual children. But they hadn't even considered that, and she should have known that it wouldn't make a difference to them. They weren't looking to see what they could get from her. They were looking to see what they could give. They spoiled her beyond words, and maybe it was good that she got away, because a person could get soft when all their children wanted to do was take care of them. She almost laughed, but it was a little sad, because she was walking away from that. But she felt she was walking into something that could end up being a lot better for everyone involved, including herself. Just like Pianse had said, she was sure she would find that she still had some rough edges that needed shaved off. Chapter 6.
Is it okay if I come see you?
Pianse stood along the beach, holding his phone in his hand and looking at the stars that shone brightly in the sky overhead. The breeze from the lake felt fresh and bracing, although chilly, and the only sound was the waves crashing along the shore. He put his children to bed less than half an hour ago and had come out to the shore to think. When Lana had asked for 2 weeks, he had hoped she wasn't going to take the entire 2 weeks. But when he didn't hear anything after a day, and then all day today, he had started to think that maybe she was going to make him wait. The thought had been hard. Even though he knew that she was trying to make sure that she was making the right decision, and he respected that, and wanted her to, there was a part of him that wanted her to jump up and down and be excited that he had offered marriage. Of course, the clumsy way he had done it didn't exactly incite a woman into the throes of romance. Maybe he needed a little practice on that. But now his stomach churned as he held his phone up and texted back. Of course, anytime. His fingers hovered over his phone, trying to figure out how he could tell her that he didn't really want her walking toward the lighthouse in the dark, but not wanting to boss her, when another text came in.
I'm pulling into the lighthouse lane now.
She was driving? As far as he could recall, she'd never driven to the lighthouse. I'll meet you in front.
Okay.
He shoved his phone back in his pocket and strode back to the lighthouse, tossing his shoes on the stoop by the door before walking around the other side and coming to the small railing as her car pulled in beside his. Her light shut off and her door opened, and he still didn't know what he was going to say, what this meant. Didn't think about it over much, just hurried to her door, hoping he wasn't out of line, and he stood beside it as she stood. He hadn't been planning it, but he stepped forward as her door closed and put his arms around her, drawing her closer, not realizing until that very second how scared he was that what he had suggested might drive her off forever. I know it's only been 2 days, but I missed you.
It's been 2 long days,
she said, and he couldn't stop the relief he felt when her arms came around him and she pressed close to him. That was a good sign, wasn't it? He didn't want to examine it too closely. He closed his eyes and laid his cheek on the top of her head. He wasn't sure how long they stood like that. Before she pulled back a little, he let her go.
Can we walk along the beach?
Somehow their hands met as she moved, and he threaded their fingers together. It had been a long time since he'd held a woman's hand, and it felt perfect in his. He hadn't even realized he missed such a simple thing. He thought maybe she enjoyed it too, because she smiled as she looked at their hands and then glanced up at him. There was enough light from the moon and the stars that he could see the pleasure on her face. I'd love it if we could do that, he murmured, thinking that it was a promising beginning. She nodded, and then he led the way beside the lighthouse and down to the beach. The water was fairly calm and the waves were small, but the rhythmic sound of them breaking on the shore was familiar and beloved and seemed a fitting backdrop as they started walking south, their hands swinging between them. They walked in silence for maybe 5 minutes, and he enjoyed just being beside this woman who had come to mean so much to him. He wasn't even sure when, but he had never considered anyone else to be the mother of his children. And until he asked her, and waited 2 whole days to hear what she had to say, he hadn't realized how much it meant to him that she would say yes.
I talked to my children today. Tonight, actually.
Okay, he said when she paused and didn't say anything more. A sense of foreboding filled his chest, heavy and ominous.
They made me see that asking you to wait 2 weeks for my answer was not a very nice thing to do, and I'm sorry.
I told you, you can have as much time as you want.
I know. That's because you're a kind man. But I'm talking about me. I was inconsiderate.
I disagree. You need to take as much time as necessary in order to make a decision that you feel is right, that you feel God wants you to. Do what works for your family.
My decision is yes. It's yes because you're the best man I know, hands down. Your character, your commitment, your determination to do right, even though it means changing your entire life, giving up things I know you loved, and taking on something that I know you weren't sure about, and in fact, seemed like a crazy thing to do to the rest of the world. I admire that. I admire that so much, and I love it. I love you, she said, stopping and turning to face him. His whole chest had erupted in fireworks when she had started talking, and he still didn't know if he could find words to reply. She saw what he had done and admired it. She said that he was the best man she knew. She gave him compliments that he wasn't sure he deserved, but that made his whole world seem somehow brighter and more exciting. Like the path ahead was well lit now, instead of being in shadowy darkness. Maybe that was all because in the last few seconds he'd learned that Lana was going to be walking that path beside him. Are you sure? He said, praying that it was a foolish question. I said I love you. I'm sure about that. I'm sure that this is where God wants me. And while the idea of raising children at my age is scary, the idea of doing it beside you is not.
She took the words right out of my mouth, he said with a little bit of a laugh, but he didn't want to ruin the intensity of the moment, so he sobered immediately. I'm sorry that I did such a terrible job of asking you to marry me. You would think at my age I would have figured out that it was like a backhanded slap, not telling you how I feel. I don't often share that with people.
It's okay.
He put a finger over her lips. No, it's not. If I'm asking you to join your life with mine, your name with mine, to spend your life with me and be my wife, the very least I can do is to tell you that I love you. That from the very moment I met you, I couldn't stop thinking about you. The kindness you showed my dad, the laughter you brought into his life, the time that you gave sitting in a chair beside him watching him fish, making sure that he had someone to look in on him, and doing what I should have been doing all along.
You're busy.
He touched her lips again, more of a caress, but she closed them while his finger traced down and around the bottom of her jaw. You are just as busy as me. You made time. You made time for him. You made time for me, and you told me plainly what I needed to do, even though you had no reason to expect that I would listen to you.
You did.
Because I admired you. Because I knew you were right. Because every time I'm around you, you teach me something or prompt me to be more. And I'm drawn to that, almost against my will.
I'm not sure that's a compliment.
Consider it one for sure. That the attraction I feel for you, there might be a physical attraction there, but it's a soul attraction. I would never have said I believed in soulmates, but it feels like you are that for me. As different as we are, actually, I think that makes it even better, because why would I want to be living with a mirror image of myself? What would be the point in that?
Same. I love our differences. I'm sure sometimes they will be irritating, but you have strength where I have weakness.
And you have strength for my weakness. And I think we'll make a really good team. More than that, I can't imagine being without you. I don't want to be. That's why I want to get married. His words made her smile, and she moved closer.
This is scary for me.
It's scary for me, too, although I'm not sure it's for the same reasons. When I got married before, I guess I was a little more naive. Now that I'm older, it's scary for a whole bunch of reasons that I wouldn't even have thought of back when I was in my 20s.
Yeah, I'm different. Physically different.
She lifted her brows, and he understood that was an area where she was insecure. He was, too. Maybe he could tell her that. Just the idea of saying it felt scary.
But I'm also a completely different person than I was then. I have a family, and while they said they would welcome you and our children with open arms, I'm sure there's going to be issues along the way.
I'm sure there will be. And I'm different physically as well. You're not the only one with those fears. They didn't say anything as they looked at each other, and he supposed that maybe both of them were trying to process that it didn't matter. He certainly didn't care. And from the look on her face, he was getting the feeling that she didn't either.
I think that physical appearance is the least important thing, and I'm not sure it's important at all, she finally said softly.
He grinned. I was kind of getting the feeling that was what you were going to say, and I agree. I think you're beautiful, and yeah, stop shaking your head. He took both hands and put one on either side of her head. Beautiful from the inside out. Beautiful on the outside as well. I find my eyes drawn to you wherever we're anywhere near each other. I just like looking at you. The way I like looking at the lake or looking at the stars at night. Just, there's something about you that makes me want to have my eyes on you if you are within sight.
So I have a tendency to stare at you too, but I suppose not exactly that way.
He nodded, moving his hands over her cheeks, and he thought that maybe they didn't need to talk anymore. She said yes. He told her he loved her, and she knew that they would need to get married soon so they could move ahead with the adoption. They could talk about that more later, but he wanted to kiss her. And she seemed to want that too, since she stepped a little closer, and her arms slipped around him, her hands moving up his back, her fingers touching lightly, and it felt so good he sighed. How long had it been since someone had touched him like that? Like they loved him. Your touch says more than words to me, he murmured.
I intended for it to, she whispered back.
And then his head lowered, and their lips met, and he didn't exactly forget about her hands on his back, but he thought about other things, her soft sigh, the way her body moved against his, her scent and her taste, and how it felt like she trusted him, and how he hoped he deserved her trust and never let her down. He lifted his head a while later and rested his forehead on hers. "I wish you didn't have to drive home," he murmured softly. He wanted to spend the night with her, every night for the rest of his life.
"I wish I didn't either."
She sounded sad. "Maybe we can get married soon?"
"Yes."
"When should we tell the kids?"
"Tomorrow?"
"Yeah. Maybe we can have a picnic after school on the beach and tell them then."
"That sounds very nice,"
she said, and it made him smile, although part of him wished that he had thought of doing something that nice when he had asked her to begin with. Maybe he could make it up on their first anniversary. He'd have to think about that. If he was going to be a husband, he wanted to be a good one, the very best. "I love you. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make sure that you never feel like your decision was a mistake." He meant that with his whole heart and soul.
"It was not. It is not. It is the exact right thing."
Her words made him smile, and he lowered his head again. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.